Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. 5 years ago, I had never heard of the Gulen movement. And then I began getting graduate students from Turkey who came to the University of Houston and who wanted to study with me. And some of these students were members of the movement. So, and of course, they wanted to do theses on the movement. So that was my introduction to the Gulen movement. Then I made one of 4 interfaith and research trips to Turkey. And my area is really social movements. So during those first couple of trips, of course, we visited many of the schools in Turkey. We visited several of the private hospitals. We visited Zaman newspaper. We visited Bank Aisha. We visited Kimse Yakmu, many of the Gulen institutions. And I came back to Houston with 2 basic questions. My first question was, where's the money? Who's financing all of this? Just top-notch institutions. And we know that takes money. So that was the first question. And of course, at the same time, there were increasing voices of the critics asking questions like, is it Saudi Arabia? Is it Iran? Is it the American CIA? So my project started out as a financial one. And then I had a second question, and that was, I suspected that at least some of the money was coming from individuals. And then the question becomes, why? Why would people give the amounts of money it would take to finance these institutions? So that's how my project started. In April of 2008, I spent 2 weeks in Istanbul, Bursa, and Mudanya, trying to look at the financial structures of the movement. So what I'm going to do today in the brief 14 minutes I have left is give you some of the general patterns of what I saw in terms of finances behind the movement, and then to try to answer the second question of why. Let me start by describing the first evening. The first evening we were in Istanbul. We were hosted by 8 of the wealthiest entrepreneurs in Istanbul, certainly the wealthiest supporters of the movement in Turkey. And a beautiful mansion on the outskirts of the Bosphorus. It was a wonderful evening. And 4 of these 8 people were some of the original people who had heard Mr. Gulen in Izmir and who put up some of the initial money behind the movement. It was a wonderful evening that went 6 or 7 hours. But imagine the task before me. As you know, in Turkish culture, in Islam, the right hand shouldn't know what the left hand's doing in terms of giving. So I consider myself a quite good interviewer, but this was a challenge. How do you get from these people concrete numbers? I wanted to know, what do you give? What does the average person give? So it took 3 or 4 hours of drinking tea and eating that kind of meat that's not cooked, but you cook it in spices. Oh, these people just down pounds of that. Finally, after 3 or 4 hours, I jumped in solidly and I said, I really need your help. Can you give me some kind of estimate of what people in your position might contribute to the movement? And there was a stone silence, so they sort of looked at each other. And finally, one of the gentlemen, 92 years old, said to me, well, Dr. Ebaugh, I gave 10 million this year. That's just an example. And the other fellow said, well, 2 weeks ago I gave 5 million. And I thought, well, here's a start. I said, is that typical? And then they said, well, if they had to make a guess that everybody in the room gave at least $1 million once or twice a year. But they said the average person in the movement gives somewhere between 5 and 20% of their earnings, of their income per year. And I looked around and they all sort of shook their heads. One of them said, that sounds kind of low, but that's an estimate. So together those 8 people came up with 10%. They said that's their best estimate throughout the whole movement, not just the wealthy people, the businessmen, but that 10% of whatever you made seemed to be kind of an average. That was wonderful research-wise, because then I could go to the second group and I could say, you know, I've been told 10% is about the number. Would you agree? So that's what I started with. 5 of the gentlemen that night had just put up money to finance a new hospital in Istanbul. So that's sort of some of what they did behind the movement. Okay, then I interviewed 103 people in the course of 2 weeks in these 3 cities. I interviewed other businessmen, particularly in Bursa, but then I also interviewed in a lot of professional groups, engineers, doctors, teachers, and then 2 wonderful groups of blue-collar workers. And the pattern was that 10% seemed to be a pretty good average. Now, that may not seem like a lot of money, but times that by how many supporters there are. We don't know how many there really are. There's no membership list. You know, I had done work in the Vatican earlier, and that was great. Because you could go and get membership lists for various things. There's no membership list, so nobody knows how many supporters there are. But the general estimate was there could well be 6 or 7 million people in Turkey, connected to the movement in various ways. And if you, everybody gives. I met hardly anyone in all of my interviewing that didn't contribute something financially to the movement. Not only money, but volunteer time. That's where a lot of the resources come from. People who volunteer their time and their resources over and over again. Okay, so that's the first point, that giving is just part of the movement. Now, also, I interviewed the top CEOs of some of the Gulen-related institutions. I interviewed Mr. Kabaka at the bank, at Bank Asha. I interviewed Mr. Demanli at Zaman. I interviewed officials at Samanyolu TV, at Kimsi Yakmu, at the schools, at Fatah University, at a lot of the media institutions in Turkey. And I wanted to know the history of the establishment of these institutions. Who put up the initial money? Where did it come from? Where did the capital come from? And then how was it sustained? And I began to notice some patterns, some very strong patterns. And that is that with the exception of the bank, and with the exception of Kimsi Yakmu, those 2 exceptions, there were general patterns in terms of the other institutions. And here's how it works. The businessmen and other people in the movement, but a lot of the real capital comes from these entrepreneurs, would put up the initial money to buy the land, to build the buildings, and operating capital for the first, usually 2 or 3 years. And then gradually, these institutions, and fast, in my estimation, became self-supporting. The schools, for example, charge tuition. They're private schools. And so they charge somewhere between $7,000 and $9,000 a year in tuition. All the schools in which I interviewed also provide scholarships for somewhere between 20 to 25% of their students who can't afford it. But other than that, the students pay tuition. So the schools become self-supporting. And then the sponsors go to another project in Turkey or increasingly outside of Turkey. They're building schools in Africa. I interviewed these group of businessmen in Bursa that had just come back from Darfur, where they provided 40 head of cattle for Qurban in Darfur. And they had also found a village that had been destroyed, and they promised those people that within 2 years they would rebuild their village. So they came back to Bursa to talk to their business colleagues in Bursa to raise money to rebuild that village. But, so as one project gets self-supporting, they move to another one. Same thing with Samanyolu TV, although that took a little longer than they anticipated. The bank was interesting. A lot of people call this a Gulen-related bank, but it's really not, as Mr. Kabaka explained to me. In the early 90s, some businessmen said to Mr. Gulen, when he visited Istanbul, "Are we ready for an interest-free bank?" And he said, yes, I think it's time. So they collected a lot of their friends in the financial community, in fact, 340, I think, who bought shares in the bank. Mr. Ebaugh said some of them were Gulen-related people, many of them weren't. I asked him about the current board. He said he doesn't know how many on the board really are Gulen supporters. So it's really not a Gulen institution per se. Now let's talk, and Dialoog is the relief organization that was founded after the earthquake in the Marmara region. It's a disaster relief association that raises between 16 and 20 million a year for disaster research, now all over the world. And it's the one very hierarchically organized institution, unlike the way a lot of the other institutions are organized. Now, let's talk about why. The next question, I was pretty convinced at that time that this is where the money's coming from. In Turkey, I saw no government money going into these institutions. There's a little bit in other countries. I just came from Azerbaijan. I'm tracing the movement now out of Turkey as it's moved around the world. For example, in Azerbaijan, the government put up the original land and building when the first school was built in 1993. That was the first school outside of Turkey. So there's some government money sometimes in the beginning of the project, but usually these buildings are so dilapidated, it takes more to renovate them than they're worth. Also, in countries like, I was in Melbourne, where they also have schools. The government there supports private schools. So the Gulen schools get support, just like any other private school. Do you know in Texas we now have 25 Gulen schools? They're called charter schools, totally financed by the state, and it's causing problems. 3 minutes, okay. Let me say a little bit now about why. Why do people do this? That was the next question. I asked these original 8 entrepreneurs, why would you write a check for 10 million? What motivates you to do this? There are really 3 reasons. The first is, it's embedded in Turkish culture and in Islam to give. Hospitality is just part of the culture and part of the religion. Not only zakat, everyone says zakat, that's just minimal. But they talk about concepts like sadaqah, voluntary giving to please God. And most of the giving is done through these vakifs, these charitable foundations that get set up. So it's very, very embedded in the culture. So when Mr. Gulen started asking the businessmen to support these institutions, it wasn't anything too new for them. They were used to this in the culture and in Islam. The second thing I think that's very, very important to understand the giving has to do with the sohbets, the local circles, in which I think is the heart of the movement. If you ask me, the very heart, the structural heart of the movement, that's what I think it is. These local circles where people meet at least once a week, based on geography, residence, profession, age, whatever. And they meet, they talk about interpretations of the Quran, they talk about Gulen writings, and they talk about needs in the community. What needs financing? And for many, many of these people, that's the heart of their life. Over and over they would say to me, I just live for my sohbet. Anything else during the week can come and go, but not that. It's like it's almost sacred to them, because that's where they find their sense of belonging and meeting and meaning and camaraderie. But let me make a final statement. Yes, those are the 2 main reasons, but there's also a third one, and that's networks. Like Tucson, 10,000 businessmen involved in that organization. Think of the networking. So there's also some practical rewards in terms of these networking potentials.